Welcome to the Floyd Memorial Library podcast, where we sit down with the people who give shape, texture, and voice to the stories that matter here on the North Fork of Long Island, and sometimes far beyond. Some of our guests are rooted here by generations, others join us from elsewhere to share their work, their perspective, or their connection to the community. But all bring something that resonates, something that adds to the ongoing conversation. We talk about what's changing, what's worth holding on to, and the currents of history, both quiet and loud, that run through this place. I'm your host, Christopher Bianchi, and for episode 215, we sit down with Alexander Stille, an acclaimed author and journalist whose work has helped illuminate some of the most complex corners of Italian history, politics, and culture, from his examination of Jewish life under fascism, to his investigations in the Sicilian Mafia, to his portraits of power, family, and memory. Alexander's books bridge rigorous reporting with deeply human storytelling. In our conversation, we explore how his upbringing, shaped in part by his father's career as a prominent journalist in Italy, helped form his worldview and his path as a writer. We talk about what first drew him to study Italy, how his interest has evolved across decades of research, and insights he's gained from his work like Benevolence and Betrayal, Excellent Cadavers, and The Sack of Rome. We also discuss his more personal memoir, The Force of Things, as well as his recent look at American counterculture in the Sullivanians. Beyond his books, Alexander reflects on the shifting landscape of journalism and some of the most misunderstood aspects of Italian history. And since he lives on the North Fork, we also talk about what first brought him here. So I hope you enjoy episode 215 with Alexander Stille. This episode was recorded August 14th, 2025. Thank you so much for coming on the Floyd Memorial Library podcast today. It's really a pleasure to have you on today.
It's my pleasure to be here.
Thank you. And so just in the beginning, I'd like to start off if you can give us a little background about yourself, where you were born and raised.
So I was born in New York City in 1957. And grew up there, but my father was Italian, but with a complicated background. His family he was actually born in Russia. His family were Russian Jews who left what was then the Soviet Union immediately after the Russian Revolution. They settled in Italy, made a life for themselves there, but then had to leave because of Mussolini's racial laws, passed in 1938, and came to this country. In 1941, my father arrived shortly before Pearl Harbor, then was immediately drafted into the U.S. Army and sent back to Italy during the war, and became a U.S. citizen. And then he met my mother after the war in this country. My sister and I were born after that. So we had that background, and that ended up being important to me for a number of reasons. My father, interestingly, didn't teach us Italian growing up, which I regretted. But then I began studying it on my own, and my father's reluctance to talk about his past and talk about his life before the war kind of intrigued me. He never took us to Italy, didn't teach us Italian. So for me, that was a little bit like if you tell the kids as you're going out, whatever you do, don't go into the attic. For me, the attic was Italy and that part of the family past. So I got very interested in that, learned Italian reasonably well, and then went to live there after graduating from college and worked there for 2 years, which helped me really consolidate and become fluent in Italian, learn a lot about Italian culture and politics. It was a very intense time in Italian life. There was left-wing terrorism, right-wing terrorism, kneecappings, bombings, kidnappings. You would meet people with bulletproof cars and bodyguards and relatives who'd been kidnapped or in some cases killed. And that got me very interested in what was going on in Italy, trying to make sense of all this political violence in a society that was so beautiful and interesting and seemed to me in many ways quite stable. And that sort of pushed me toward becoming a journalist, actually. And so I thought, wow, if I could sort of explain these seeming sets of contradictions in the society that I'm now living in, that would be a really interesting thing to do, and that the newspapers that generally covered this gave an impression of a society. If you read just these stories about kidnappings and shootings and bombings, you'd think the place was coming apart at the seams, but it was very obvious to me that it was not coming apart at the seams, that something else was going on. It was more complicated and more interesting, and so I thought that would be, if I could figure out how to write about that, that would be a contribution of sorts. So I returned to New York, went to journalism school, to Columbia Journalism School, where I now, 45 years later, whatever, teach, and started in journalism, but with the idea of finding my way back to Italy to write about some of these things that had first drawn me into it. And my first book, called Benevolence and Betrayal, 5 Italian Jewish Families Under Fascism, was, for me, a way of exploring my family's past, what my father had experienced as a young person, and what had driven our family out of Italy. My secret hope had been that I would get my father to open up about his own experience, which he steadfastly refused to do. But when he wasn't really on guard, he would talk about things that were very, very interesting about other people and that time, and it was actually helpful to me in identifying some of the people that I ended up writing about, but he wouldn't talk about his own experience. But that was a great experience, getting to know the people that I wrote about who'd had really significant experiences, during the fascist period, and was a real human and historical education for me, and that became my first book, and sort of convinced me that I wanted to do that kind of longer narrative journalism rather than, let's say, day-to-day daily journalism or periodical journalism, although I've done a lot of that as well. So that's kind of my foundation.
Yes. And I was just curious, even with your father, it's probably in your book, but did they say why they decided on Italy, moving from Russia to Italy at that?
Well, supposedly, my father, according to family legend, my aunt was the keeper of family lore. He had sort of looked around and decided that Italy was the best place for Jews in Europe in the 1920s, and he wasn't entirely wrong. It was a society with a small Jewish population and a high level of toleration for its Jewish minority. I think, however, he had been, we don't quite know this, but I think he had traveled a little bit as a younger man and perhaps had been to Italy and had a good experience there. But he was correct in thinking that it was a place where Jews could live quite safely and comfortably. The fascist revolution happened not long after he and my grandmother and father and aunt moved there, but that didn't change their circumstances initially. One of the things that was intriguing about and what made me want to write about Italian Jews during fascism is that whereas we now associate fascism with anti-Semitism because of Hitler, because of World War II, for the first 11 years that Mussolini was in power, for the first 16 years, the fascist government was not anti-Semitic. There were many enthusiastic Jewish fascists, people who were conservative-minded Jews who felt that the law and order platform of Mussolini was fine with them, and they weren't overly concerned with the lack of democratic freedom. There were many also anti-fascist Jews as well. So what I in fact wanted to write about was this set of contradictions, the very particular nature of of the life of Jews in fascist Italy, where the normal equations of fascist equal anti-Semitism didn't apply, and that meant that people's behavior was very different. And their sense of danger was much less. They couldn't believe that in Italy, where they'd been treated well and lived as equals, in which the home of the Vatican, that something as terrible as the Holocaust could happen. And as a result, many of them were very slow to react to the threats that they were under.
And you mentioned talking with your father, but it was hard for it was hard for him to open up about his time in Italy.
He would start telling stories about other people and say, wow, that's really interesting. Let me get my tape recorder. And he'd shut down. No. But later in life, my second to last book, a book called The Force of Things, A Marriage in War and Peace, is about my parents. And toward the end of his life, my father did agree to sit down and have interviews about his life, and my mother did as well. And I had a lot of documentation after my parents died, letters and other family documents that I'd collected over the years. So I was able to eventually do one of the stories that interested me the most when I first got interested in this stuff.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned he was in the war and served in the U.S. Army in Sicily.
Yeah, he was in the Intelligence Bureau, and they needed people that spoke the languages of the countries they were about to occupy, Italy being one of them. And so he had had a little bit of journalistic experience back in Italy, and so this young 23-year-old corporal was put in charge of Radio Palermo when he had a very comfortable, cushy war compared to other people who were, dodging bullets on the beachhead and things of that kind. So initially they were in North Africa listening to Italian radio broadcasts and translating them for people to try to gain news that might be of military value. And then they needed to defascistize, essentially, Italian media because it had been entirely controlled by the fascist regime. And so he, as a young 23-year-old, was, put in charge of Radio Naples and hired these teenage kids who were not compromised by fascism to help run this radio station. And then they went from there to Radio Naples and eventually made their way up the boot of Italy by the end of the war. So that was his war experience.
But he would eventually come back to the U.S. But was it important to him because he would eventually write for was it the Corriere
della Sera, the main Milan newspaper. So his last assignment in the army was working out of Milan, and he met people there. And because of the declaration of war between the U.S. and Italy, there were no Italian correspondents based in the U.S., and so he was already an American citizen because of his service in the U.S. Army. So he had a leg up on everybody else. He could go back to New York and start working while everybody else was applying for visas and trying to get their papers in order. So that was a piece of good fortune for him and allowed him to establish himself as a journalist writing from New York for Italy's largest newspaper.
And then for you, you said you grew up. Did you grow up mostly in New York?
I grew up in New York. Yeah.
And when did you know, even was it in high school, or that you wanted to you were interested in writing and journalism, or did that come later?
Well, I knew I was interested in writing, but I thought I wanted to write fiction when I was in college. And I thought journalism was kind of a lower order form. I wrote some short stories in college, and then I kind of ran out of gas and ideas and the limited experience of a 21-year-old. And I thought, I'm washed up as a fiction writer. I can't do this. And I was kind of floundering around trying to figure out what I wanted to do. I worked in book publishing for a year in New York while living with my parents and saving a little money. But my dream was to go live in Italy, so I was saving money and working on my Italian. My aunt, my father's sister, was an Italian teacher, and we'd meet every week and talk Italian. And so at that time I was working in book publishing, and what I was able to find work in when I went to Italy, was working for an Italian book publisher in Milan. Milan's the sort of publishing capital of Italy, and because they translate a lot of books from English, someone who knew both languages and was a native speaker of English was of use to them. So I did that for 2 years. But then during that period, as I mentioned, I was absorbing, trying to understand this country that I had moved to, where all this political violence was happening, and I began to read interesting nonfiction writers who were doing, in a way, operating in a narrative form. People like Norman Mailer's Executioner's Song, V.S. Naipaul, a very interesting Sicilian writer named Leonardo Sciascia, who both wrote novels and wrote very intelligently about current events and political events, and used narrative technique in writing about contemporary events. And so I thought, okay, since I love novels and I love narrative, but I think I want to be a journalist, this is a way to do it that satisfies different parts of myself, that and is a kind of journalism that I think I would love to do. So that was my intention in doing it.
And was that in the 80s that you went over?
Yeah, that would have been in my period in Milan between 80 and 82. Then I came back and graduated from journalism school in 83 and began working as a journalist, and then, did journalistic work for several years, but began working on the side on what would become my first book, which I started in 86, and was able to convince my employer to give me time off to do research, and went back to Italy to do initial reporting, and went back again and again, and then moved there full-time in 1990 and stayed there for 3 years, and during which I began working on my second book.
Yes.
And doing political correspondence from Italy.
And then I just wanted to ask about your mom. Did she work at all or during
She
this
did.
time?
She was a magazine editor and eventually a book editor, and in the last phase of her life, she used to work for a magazine called The Reporter magazine, which was actually quite prominent in like the 50s and 60s, and now no longer exists. In her last years, she cut books for the Reader's Digest, and so if you ever see the Reader's Digest Bible, you'll know that my mother, Elizabeth Stille, cut it down to a much shorter length, and she always insisted that she'd improve the Bible. She said, "You don't need all those begats." So she was doing that, but she was very helpful to me when I wrote my first book. She was still alive, and she copy edited, and very, very well, I have to say.
And you mentioned your first book. Was your second book, was that Excellent?
My second book was a book called Excellent Cadavers, which was about the war against the mafia and political corruption in Italy. When, again, part of this experience that I had living in Italy in the early 80s, along with all this political violence that was happening in the north, there was a major mafia war going on in Sicily. And I remember just 2 days after I arrived in Italy in January of 1980, the governor of Sicily was assassinated. And everybody was immediately asking themselves, so who did this? Could it be that the Red Brigades, the main left-wing terrorist group, was now operating in Sicily, or was it a mafia killing? What's going on? Nobody knew. It was one of these mysteries that Sicilian life is full of. And I remember very specifically clipping a newspaper article later that year in which a priest in Palermo had been killed sort of gangland style. And that was really interesting. What's going on here? Why would a priest be assassinated? Then there was a second day story that said, well, this wasn't just any ordinary priest. He was friends with one of the major mafia bosses of Palermo. He had an unusually large apartment for a parish priest with many designer suits and a elegant wardrobe. And there were rumors that this mafia family buried bodies in the cemetery of the church where he operated. Again, another interesting mystery. I filed that away of like, gee, it would be interesting we figured out what really was going on here. So later on, when I was living in Italy in the early 90s, we began to learn a lot more about what was happening, what had been happening for a number of years in Sicily. A number of investigations opened up, and two very extraordinary prosecutors had begun working in Palermo and greatly advanced our understanding of what had been happening inside of the closed and secret world of Cosa Nostra. Then they were assassinated in the summer of 1992. I was working as a journalist over there and covered those events. And it occurred to me that that was a kind of end of a period, and that this was maybe the opportunity to write about what that period they're killing was, a kind of end point of a long period of collusion between the Italian state and organized crime, and this represented a kind of break in the dam. So that then became, I decided to make that the subject of my second book, and did the reporting and research for that before returning to the States in the summer of 1993.
And did your dad get to see that book
Yes, I'm trying to think of exactly when he died on June 2nd of 1995.
Okay.
And he saw the publication of my first book, which he'd been very worried about because it was getting into this, family territory that made him nervous. But then when the book was published and got a lot of good reviews, he suddenly came around and said, oh, wow, okay, you did something good here. And I'm a little hazy as to what month Excellent Cadavers came out and whether he was still alive when it did come out. I'd have to sort of check the dates, but I think he might have. And, it was satisfying for him as a journalist to see me do work that about the country where he'd grown up, and that met with praise from people he respected in the world of journalism.
Yes. And for your second book, were you hesitant to write about something like that, and worried about some of the, not that you were exposing, but just with the subject matter of the book?
Well, when I started working on that as a book, I made the calculation that the mafia at that point, because after the assassination of these two prosecutors that I wrote about, there was such a heavy crackdown on the mafia, and there was an explosion of defectors from the mafia who were now testifying before magistrates, that I made the calculation that they had so many other more urgent problems to worry about that a annoying American journalist poking around was not going to be one of their top priorities. And reporting in a place like Palermo, which is a large city, you can be pretty anonymous. I did have some other experiences at other times reporting in small towns where there was organized crime presence, which was much more uncomfortable because people knew within 5 minutes of your arrival who you were and what you were doing and who you were seeing, and you were very much under surveillance. And that could be, uncomfortable.
Yes.
More, and this is, one of the tricky parts of being a journalist. It may be more dangerous for the people you're talking to than to you. I had an experience going into a small town between Rome and Naples where a African immigrant had been killed by local organized crime. They were they were illegal immigrants who were exploited badly, picking tomatoes for, peanuts. And so I went down to this town, found a young African immigrant to interview, invited him to have a coffee in a local coffee shop. And as we were sitting there, a big burly guy comes over and just sits at our table. And I said, can I help you? He said, I'm just listening. And I knew that was just pure intimidation because I was interviewing this guy in English and this other person didn't speak English. I was talking to him in Italian. And I said, well, right now I'm talking to this person here. If you'd like to talk to me, I'm happy to talk to you afterwards, but I have to ask you to leave. Fortunately, he left. I didn't suffer any consequences, but that was their way of letting you know, like,
you're being watched.
You're being watched. We know you're up to, and we have, big, strong guys who can mess you up if they want to. Mm-hmm. But that wasn't so much the case with the book. I never had that type of experience in Palermo.
Mm-hmm. And now to move to another book, in The Sack of Rome, you discuss the rise of Silvio Berlusconi. How did that book come about, and just writing about that subject matter?
Well, that book came about because, I was living in Italy first in the early 80s, then throughout much of the 80s, and then steadily between 90 and 93. I watched Italian politics change, from, Italy was more affected by the Cold War probably than any other country in Western Europe. It had the largest communist party, when the Berlin Wall fell, Italian politics changed very radically. And I had watched the rise of Silvio Berlusconi from the time I was living in Milan in the early 80s when he began. It's important for people to know that private television basically didn't exist in Italy until the late 1970s. It was all dominated by the state broadcasting system. Gradually, it was opened up to private TV stations, and Berlusconi was the first and most aggressive to enter into that market. And after a very short period of competition, he bought out his competitors and achieved a kind of monopoly of private TV in the early 80s. And I was living there during that time and saw this new empire rise up. I was working in a town outside of Milan, right where he had built a kind of model city. He made his first fortune in real estate by creating a kind of American-style gated community. And so I had, visited this place and swam in their swimming pool and seen the kind of model of society that Berlusconi was creating. So I was very familiar with him and that world. And then as the political system changed in the post-Berlin Wall period, the early 90s, the Communist Party changes its name. The Christian Democratic Party, which had dominated Italy for the entire post-World War II period, whose whole reason for being was based on the defense against communism. So their kind of major reason for appealing to the voters had suddenly evaporated with the end of the Cold War. And all this corruption, which had kind of accumulated over decades, that most people were prepared to tolerate as long as it meant we're not going communist, suddenly became much more present to people and much more salient. And all these corruption investigations started in early 1992 and had basically devastated the 5 major parties that had participated in government during the previous 45 years. Mm-hmm. And so suddenly the whole political world and the whole political landscape changed. This was very threatening to Berlusconi, who had built his TV empire in part with the support of the main government parties, and had also participated in a system of corruption and bribery to maintain its position. And so he was deeply threatened by the changes that were happening in that period. And after seeing that no one was coming to his rescue and the traditional parties were literally disintegrating, decided, okay, I'm going to have to do this myself, and creates his own political party and his own political machine right before our eyes. And I was covering this very closely as a journalist. And, I knew the situation. I'd written about his company to a degree before his entrance into politics. I knew some of the people in that world. And what was interesting was that it became pretty clear to me early on in the mid-90s, as his career was taking off, this represented something new and quite important. It wasn't just a kind of funny, weird Italian story. Many people kind of dismissed Berlusconi as kind of a clown and an anomaly. And what was clear to me was that he was creating a new kind of politics based on media, money, and celebrity, that he had pioneered a kind of right-wing populism that was an effective formula after the Cold War, in which the parties of the left were, in crisis. Mm-hmm. And suddenly he was winning over working class voters, even though he was the richest man in Italy. And that the terms of politics were changing, and he was writing the playbook. We didn't know this at the time, but in many ways, the Trump phenomenon, the phenomena of other right-wing populists, was very much written by and created by Berlusconi. And so I was very interested in trying to explain and document the ways in which Berlusconi was, whether one liked it or not, an innovator in the kind of political formula that he was putting together. And with now, my book came out in I think 2005, 2006. 20 years later, it's, I think, holds up really well. I mean, if you read it, you think, wait a second, I recognize all this. Mm-hmm. The strategies that Trump has used very successfully were strategies that Berlusconi had used quite effectively 30 years before. The polarization of society, the creation of alternate reality, alternate media, his understanding that appearance mattered more than the actual reality of things. And this, in a sense, billionaire populism, that somebody whose interests were quite far from that of ordinary people could appeal culturally to working class people. And, he was very effective in creating messages and slogans that worked. The kind of old kinds of politics in which breaking the norms of traditional politics, appearing to be a non-politician, mm-hmm. Using coarse and even obscene language, bragging about his sex life, being transgressive, was actually a sign of things that might have hurt many politicians in the past were actually signs of authenticity that endeared himself to his voters in ways that were entirely new. And someone like Trump does that, quite effectively all the time.
Were you surprised to see that? Because you had written the book, it was 2005. Were you surprised? Because Trump was elected 2016.
Yeah.
But just to see that come to the U.S. or that you were...
Well, in many ways, he borrowed in politics, as he did from his real estate business, as he did in TV, from American models. He was very focused on the United States and believed that to be the winning model. And so one forgets that he looked very closely at Ronald Reagan. He looked very closely at Ross Perot. We now forget about Ross Perot. But Ross Perot, because we have a system that doesn't reward third parties very well, but the fact that Ross Perot was able to win, I forget, more than 20% of the vote as a third-party candidate entirely by himself without a machinery of a party behind him, was an extraordinary achievement. And if you remember, you may not, Ross Perot went around traditional media by buying large segments of airtime where he would put on like 20-minute commercials where he would explain his way of thinking to millions of Americans. Berlusconi watched all of this and thought, okay, I can kind of combine the Morning in America Reagan message of combining anti-communism with a positive affect with the message of Ross Perot, I'm the businessman in politics, just let me under the hood of the car and I'll fix it. So he combined a lot of these elements that in fact had precedence in the U.S., but that he was able to apply because of Italy being a smaller country and him occupying a larger part of it, and Italy having a proportional electoral system where if you got 25% of the vote, you could be the largest party in the country. So the first time he ran, he got, I think, in the upper 20s, 27%, something like that. He was able to form a government with coalition partners with what here would have been, a minority share of the vote. So he was able to put all of that into practice. You think of also, figures like Jesse the Body Ventura, former professional wrestler, Arnold Schwarzenegger, who becomes governor of California, Ventura, who becomes governor of Minnesota. And they're doing it based on their celebrity status as, a wrestler or a weightlifter or a movie star. Berlusconi understood that as a formula. So he was constantly, during his business career, he was constantly running polls to find out what his name recognition was with the Italian public, his likability scores, whether people had positive or negative views of him. He was very plugged into all of that. One of the things that he did, which helped account for his success in politics, was he bought one of Italy's principal soccer teams, which had been in a period of decline, pumped a lot of money into it and made it into a very successful soccer team. And that status as as the owner and very visible owner of one of the most popular soccer teams was very much part of his appeal. So in that way, the same way that Donald Trump was able to establish himself through The Apprentice, the reality TV show that he starred in, that made him known outside of New York to tens of millions or hundreds of millions of Americans, Berlusconi had done through the ownership of private TV, through the ownership of this successful soccer team. And so what I sort of observed that Berlusconi had done, and which I think is very much present in our politics now, that what mattered in a kind of post-ideological age was not who had the best programs, but who was more authentic. People wanted to feel the authenticity of their leader. So, for example, a very revealing moment in Berlusconi's first electoral campaign was a debate with a well-known economist who was pointing out all the contradictions to Berlusconi's political program. And Berlusconi stopped him, interrupted him, and said, how many European championships have you won? I've won the UEFA Cup, the this, the that, and he rattles off these things. Until you've done something like that, don't tell me how to run, blah, blah, blah. Now, in some sense, that's an absurd answer because it has nothing to do with the points this guy was making about Berlusconi's economic program. But to many people, he thought, this is a person who does stuff and who's accomplished things, and there's something authentic about this person that this, pointy-headed economist doesn't have. And, Trump, in effect, does something quite similar, in which authenticity, people saying this person talks the way I do, this person thinks the way I do, that's why I gravitate toward them, rather than parsing too closely what the particular positions of that person might be.
Yes. I think we'll get back to some of this topic later, but I wanted to move on to you did a memoir, The Force of Things, which is more of an intimate story about your parents. Could you discuss a little bit about that book and how
Sure.
that came about?
I had always been intrigued. I grew up in a small household with just one sibling, and my parents had a very stormy, difficult marriage, often very painful. They fought a great deal. And so I spent much of my childhood wondering, like, how in the world did these two very different people come together, and why in the world did they stay together when they fought as much as they did? And so gradually, as I particularly got to know more about my father's Italian story and all of that, I felt that part of what was happening in my parents' marriage was a clash of cultures. My mother was a Protestant from the Midwest, a WASP, who was sort of had a sunny temperament and was optimistic. She was a sort of New Deal liberal who believed that the world was getting better and better. My father was an Eastern European Jew who felt that humanity was terrible. People were beasts. He was suspicious and pessimistic. And they both, I think, unfortunately, even though they were drawn to each other because of their differences also made for a difficult marriage. And when they fought, they would sometimes make the other feel bad about where they had come from. My father would ridicule my mother as being a Babbitt from the Midwest, small-minded, Midwestern, know-nothing. And I think my mother somehow secretly made my father feel that she'd done him a favor by marrying this refugee from Europe. So anyway, after they died, I was able, I'd interviewed them both during the last years of their life, which was great. And then I, after they died, inherited a lot of papers and letters, and found other letters and documents, and looked for documents in the Italian archives. And my aunt, who never married and lived with her parents until they died, had all the documents from my father's family, including, documents from Russia, from Italy. So I was able to, in a way, think about my parents the way I had thought about people I'd written about in the past who were people that I'd encountered in the archives, and trying to reconstruct what made them tick and how their lives worked. And it was really fun and interesting to reconstruct their lives and to get to know people I knew very well at one time of their life, and discover a lot about their earlier lives. And so it was just a really fun, personally satisfying project. And but also, I think, was treating their marriage as a kind of emblematic story of the 20th century. Two people who were born both in 1919, who met at mid-century at a party for Truman Capote's first book, as it happened. My mother arrived with her first husband and left the party with her second, my father. But essentially, my father and his family travel across the 20th century from, Tsarist Russia, and end up in New York. And my mother travels in the same period of time from the Midwest to New York. And so it's a collision of civilizations. And in many ways, a lot of post-war American life was the result of the mass immigration that happened because of Nazism, because of fascism. Millions of refugees leaving Europe and finding a place in this country, and in many ways contributing importantly to all kinds of fields, from abstract expressionism and painting, Billy Wilder and Ernst Lubitsch, and the cinema, in academic life. And so in that sense, my father and the people that he grew up with were part of that sea change that happened in mid-century. And so in some ways, my parents' marriage, as I interpreted it, was sort of an expression of that cross-pollination that happened in this country at the time.
Yes, definitely. And I think just because of time, I wanted to also talk about your most recent book is the Sullivanians, which is a very different topic from what you've written about in the past. What attracted you to this kind of, because it explored the radical psychotherapy commune in New York City. What attracted you to this topic?
Well, one of the nice things about being a journalist is you were a generalist, and you feel like you can write about anything if you focus on it and do the work. And so never turn down a good story if you stumble on one. Since 2004, I've been teaching at Columbia University, and I was living in the same part of New York City before that. So I've lived on the Upper West Side of Manhattan from even from the early 80s, and then close to Columbia from the early 90s. And so I simply heard at a random dinner with friends, they were telling me about people that they'd gotten to know who had been part of this unusual group. And the husband that they'd gotten to know was the son of the founder. The wife had been a therapist in this group, and all of their friends were former group members, and the group had been sort of dedicated to free love, communism, psychotherapy, and had grown up around a psychoanalytic institute that started in the 1950s and then morphed into a kind of urban commune during the 60s. And had lasted into the early 90s, that they were very secretive during the life of the group, but now the group had fallen apart, and lots of interesting things were happening among the children of the group. And I sort of listened to this and thought, wow, this is an amazing story. I've never heard about this. I've lived on the Upper West Side for decades, and yet I've known nothing about this group. They were essentially hidden in plain sight. You had like an alternate society living by very different rules and principles that were, sort of hidden in plain sight, just blocks down from where I lived. I lived on 104th Street for many years. Just 4 blocks away, a woman in this group had kidnapped her own daughter in order to reclaim her from this. Her therapist had forbidden her from seeing her infant daughter for several months. And so to regain custody of the daughter, she kidnapped the child from the building where she herself lived on one floor, and her husband and the baby were living on another floor. So I thought if I could get these people to talk to me, it would make for an amazing story. And I just started researching it and reporting it, and got a few people to talk to me, and they put me in touch with a few other people who talked to me, and it just kind of grew the way projects do. I didn't know initially that it would become a book, but the more I learned, the more people I interviewed, the deeper and more complex the story became. I realized that it should be a book, and so that's what I did.
And were there some connections out on the east end of Long Island too?
Yes, there were. One of the things that the founders of this group, a group of psychotherapists, a guy named Saul Newton, his wife Jane Pierce, had bought property and built a house, and several of the therapists had built houses in Barnes Landing out in Springs, Amagansett, on the South Fork of Long Island. And so they had a whole little community out there, And interestingly, one of their early patients was Jackson Pollock, who had a house in Springs. The critic Clement Greenberg was an early patient of theirs. He brought all these artists into their fold, bringing them in as patients. And a lot of these people were out in Springs and visiting the Pollocks. And in fact, Jackson Pollock's wife, Lee Krasner, blamed the Sullivanian therapy for Pollock's death because they didn't stop him from drinking in ways that were very self-destructive and contributed to his death. So in the 60s, with all these therapists having houses out in Amagansett, the patients, as it became kind of communal in nature, would rent houses. They didn't have as much money as the therapists, but they would find at the time prices were not as crazy on Long Island as they've since become. You could rent a big house with several bedrooms and do a summer share. And so these younger people who were patients would go in on a share in which, 15 people might, rent a 6-bedroom house someplace and hang out on weekends. And so there became a whole community out on the South Fork that would be very present. They would all take, the Long Island Railroad on Friday evening and have a party car and carry on. And, they were... So this communal life that they began developing in New York had its summer equivalent out on Long Island for many years. And they, in fact, performed theater productions out in Long Island as well, and began developing a theater company when they eventually bought a theater in New York City, the Truck and Warehouse Theater on East 4th Street. And so... the group always attracted a lot of interesting creative people. The novelist Richard Price, for example, was a patient, and he wrote skits for them in one of the performances they put on Long Island. So there was definitely a Long Island connection. Then at a certain point, after they had bought this theater in New York in the late 70s, they decided they needed their own space communally, and they bought basically a former hotel in the Catskills that could house about 250 people. And so that then became, they stopped going to Long Island and began using the Catskills as their kind of summer retreat and their rehearsal space and stuff like that.
You also live out on the North Fork. Could you talk about how you discovered the North Fork of Long Island?
Yeah, so my sister and I rented a house here in, I think, the summer of 2011. And my sister wanted to explore this area as a place to spend time. And so we did that, and then we both rented separately for a few years after that. And as often happens when people spend time in this part of the world, you fall in love with it and you think, gee, I really should buy a place. And so I bought a place in, I think it was 2015, and I've been coming here steadily ever since. And then during the pandemic, we were here for like a year and a half, pretty much full time. And in fact, I wrote most of the Sullivanian book out here on the North Fork. Plenty of time during the pandemic to work.
Yes, and enjoy.
Under very pleasant circumstances, and to have a community of people that you could see safely in a pod. So we were able to do that, which was nice and helped us kind of sink down roots in the area in ways that we might not have had a chance to do before.
Yes. And you've probably even seen the North Fork change over that time. Like you mentioned, with housing and other things have changed drastically.
Yeah, I mean, in good ways and maybe not so good ways, it's become much more expensive. Prices have pretty much doubled since the time we bought our house. I think the main car you saw around Orient where we have our house would have been a Toyota, a Honda, a Subaru, and now you see a lot of Teslas and, BMWs. And so you see, people who've been sort of priced out of the Hamptons moving over to the North Fork. And, on the positive side, there are, nice shops and restaurants. On the negative side, the children of people who grew up here have a harder time finding housing, and that's unfortunate. And I think we have to kind of address that as a community.
Yeah.
So, I suppose we've all contributed a little bit to that. But luckily it remains, I think it remains, there's enough of the agricultural businesses on the North Fork, the wineries, the farms, the farm stands that kind of ground it and make it as nice a place to be as it is.
Yes, definitely. And then I wanted to just get back to Italy a bit, just because you've lived over there and have written about it a lot. What do you think about Italy today and how its politics have evolved even since Berlusconi? And do you still see the influence of organized crime on Italian society?
Well, so Italy has, in some ways, evolved in ways that are quite similar to the U.S. And you now have a right-wing government in Italy which has its roots in a neo-fascist party, but is, I would say, comparatively moderate compared to some of the right-wing parties around the world. There's a lot of debate in Italy about whether that's real or not, whether they're disguising their true intentions or not. But I went back last summer and did a long piece for The Guardian about Giorgia Meloni and her party. And quite honestly, this is my personal opinion, they seem much more moderate to me than the people running the Trump administration right now. But, things are, I think, similar in the sense that you have a lot of disillusionment with the political system that people feel has not delivered for them in ways that they hoped it would. You have the same kind of problem of deindustrialization, of working class people who felt they were becoming marginalized and were unhappy and therefore ready to change, their sort of political orientation and move further to the right. And so that phenomenon we've seen in this country as well. You've seen the kind of inversion where the large cities and the urban, better educated classes have become the parties of the left, and the less educated working class voters have become the supporters of the right. So that kind of inversion of what were the traditional voting patterns, both in this country and in Italy, have happened there as well. And so the parties of the left have to regain the trust of disillusioned voters. On the right, whether or not they can, is an open question. Same kind of challenges that face the Democrats in this country. So they're strong parallels, but I don't see the same degree of extremism in Italy that we've seen here. You don't see as many. I mean, here we've seen numerous, political assassinations, shootings with either a racial or political bent to them. Italy has not seen that, I think, because of having lived through the terrorist period in the 70s and 80s. There's not an appetite for that sort of thing. The Italians are, I think, actually more moderate than their American counterparts.
Yes. And I was just curious what you think your dad might think of the situation today, because you mentioned your parents had different opinions, and maybe your mom would be more like we gotta keep moving forward, but your dad might be like, this is, I didn't know.
Yeah, my mother would have been out carrying signs in the No Kings demonstrations. She would have been appalled by the Trump administration. My father, I don't know how he would have reacted. I think on the one hand, he, as a journalist, always tried to detach himself from things. He stopped voting after a while because he felt he needed to be detached from political life here and be an objective political commentator. So I think he would have both been intrigued by Trump's success in, politically. I suspect, as somebody who had lived through fascism, he would have been worried by some of the things that we're seeing. The sending in the Marines to Los Angeles, tanks in Washington, D.C., that kind of thing. So I'd be very curious to know how he would have, but I couldn't say for certain how he would have reacted to the current political scene.
Italy, you think he...
I think I don't know. I'd like to think that he would have shared my analysis of the Meloni people, but I could be wrong.
Yeah. And then just lastly, looking forward, do you have any future projects you're working on or excited to dive into?
Yes, I've been, I teach at Columbia University, which, as you know, has been at the center of a lot of controversy. And the journalism school where I teach was literally right next door to the encampment, the pro-Palestine encampment that attracted so much attention. And so we've been living through this rather remarkable period in which university has become a battleground for the nation's politics. So I've begun to do some work on that and trying to, in a way, make sense of it for myself. So where does anti-Semitism begin and end, and where does legitimate criticism of Israel begin? I'm sort of trying to talk to people across the university to understand their experiences and why they feel the way they do, and try and make sense of it for myself and for others.
Definitely. Were there any last minute things you'd like to say or discuss that we haven't touched on?
Well, let's see. I think there are things having to do with the Sullivanians that might be worth bringing up. One of the things that I felt strongly about working on that is when you hear the word cult, you think of sort of crazy, possibly drugged out, zombie-like people following some leader blindly. And what I discovered in interviewing the people that I wrote about, they're very smart, interesting, thoughtful people who got involved in this in many cases, either out of idealism or out of personal vulnerability that drove them into therapy and put them into the hands of therapists who exploited the therapeutic relationship to manipulate them into doing things they might not have done otherwise. And so I think that experience has much more applicability and more in common with many much more normal experiences that people don't think of as being cult-like. This was a very normal experience in certain ways, and not the less interesting for that reason how such smart people could end up getting involved in something that became, most of us would think of as quite, I don't like to use the word crazy, but self-destructive, in which, children were taken away from their parents. People were forced into relationships they didn't want to be in, made to have children with people they didn't want to have children with, and things of that kind. But the strategies of cohesion that the group adopted are techniques that many religious groups use to maintain solidarity within the group. Many political movements use to maintain internal solidarity. Many marriages use, in a sense. I remember went to interview a woman who lived in North Carolina who lived with another woman. And this woman said, I understand why Donna got involved in this group, because I was in a marriage, and at the beginning of the marriage I had lots of friends and an active social life, and 10 years later I was alone in this marriage, and all of those relationships had evaporated, and I hadn't been kind of aware of the way in which the marriage had isolated me, and this person had taken control of my life. And so that, in a sense, is not that unusual situation, way in which people's relationship things that can become, in the end, harmful, become normalized in one's life. And anyway, so I found writing about that group very, very helpful in terms of understanding group relationships and the power of groups, and the power of cognitive dissonance in a way in which people rationalize and justify things they get into that are actually kind of at variance with many of their own deepest beliefs. Mm-hmm. So I think it's an important, powerful story, as well as being just sort of a jaw-dropping story when you get into it. Yeah. I would interview people and I'd have to sort of suppress my sense of amazement. I was thinking, what? You did what? And just kind of, remain very neutral and cool and just listen to them and hear them out.
Mm-hmm. But like you said, it makes sense in some ways where people might join groups like that, and like you mentioned, vulnerable, and just at a younger age, they might feel that's something that, whether something in the past happened, this feels like the right decision.
Well, people, it's well known that many people that join what are considered cults often join in their early 20s. This is a time of life in which people are separating from their parents. In many cases, having to push their parents away because they've lived too much in the family orbit. They're looking for at the same time, they're losing a number of connections which have grounded them. So they're vulnerable, they're uncertain what they're doing in life. A group comes along that offers a series of certainties and community as well. This group, I remember one of the first people I interviewed, was talking to me, and she said, "You're probably wondering why all these smart people got into this crazy thing." And she said, belonging. This group offered a very deep sense of belonging, and that was very powerful for people. Mm-hmm. So, so that I think is important, and also many of the things that drove people into it. After they'd been in it for a while, they had lost contact with their parents, with their friends from previous phases of their life. This was all the world they knew, and the therapy did a lot to isolate people and keep people from the other people they knew, so the entire world that you lived in was composed of this group.
Yes. And I think we see, in different ways, there can be some, with social media today and being connected to different influencers or different groups online. And
this is a world of bubbles, and they created a bubble, and now there are online bubbles, which, if you think of something like QAnon, functions very much like a cult, where you have an ideology which seems to explain everything, and the people who don't believe in it are evil. and they can't be trusted because they're evil. And so you find ways of rationalizing, when QAnon's predictions don't come true, it's because the deep state has somehow thwarted what's happening or whatever it might be. But we do live in a world in which there are many cult-like groups in which you find ways you create an isolated environment in which the information that you see confirms the belief system that you have adopted. You filter out the things that contradict it. You find ways to rationalize it. And so in that sense, and some of the people I interviewed said to me quite plainly, said, I find it much easier to understand the authoritarian tendencies of the world we're now living in, having been in a group that had authoritarian qualities to it. So
yes, definitely. No, but I want to thank you so much for taking the time to come on the podcast today and share your story and all the work you've done and all the wonderful books you have, and look forward to possibly have you back on again with future work you do. So
very good.
Thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
Well, I hope you enjoyed episode 215 with Alexander Stille. I want to thank you for listening to the Floyd Memorial Library podcast, and we'll see you next time.